another question that popped up. Angela, I'll start with you on this one. What are the pros and cons for intermittent fasting, specifically for runners?
So this is a hot topic that we get asked a lot these days. To start with, we have to understand that the goal for performance is to be able to specifically increase your fuel assumed without increasing your weight. Now, somebody may want to actually gain weight, that's fine. But putting that aside, assuming you're at roughly the weight you want to be competitive at, the goal is to increase your fuel. You can't do that rapidly. If you do it rapidly, guess what else is going to increase? Your weight. So assuming that you're going to do it gradually, there's a few problems with the tactic of intermittent fasting and weight loss for runners in particular. And one of the most just practical reasons why that's not always our first go-to. And that doesn't mean we don't utilize it. It doesn't mean you cannot implement a measure of it. I do have clients that do so successfully, but it's not usually the first tool on the shelf that we think of. Because what that does is the shorter the window that you're eating in, aside from metabolic optimization issues, there's digestive considerations. So now our goal is to get the maximum amount of fuel we can to recover, but now we have to do so spread out over less and less meals. Now we start having a practical digestive issue. Whereas if I tell someone, in fact, I just had this conversation with one of my more elite runners, I really want to increase your overall carb intake by about 30, 40 grams. But here's someone who's already, they're eating every few hours and they're getting carbs at every meal. And he simply felt that he could not do that, adding it to one meal without feeling bloated and digestive stress. But when we looked at spreading it out over multiple meals, it was no problem. Now it's just a tiny increase across multiple meals and snacks throughout the day. With intermittent fasting, we lose some of the flexibility. The other thing we lose is pockets of more difficult, not impossible, more difficult recovery. So intermittent fasting is such a broad category. So to some people, it means simply what we're already doing with most of our MetPro clients and tapering their carbohydrate intake based on their schedule for the day. And usually it means tapering carbs in the evenings. That is a form of intermittent fasting, time gating your recovery to a degree. To other people, intermittent fasting means simply not eating on certain days of the week. You're not going to see a whole lot of elite athletes doing that on a regular basis. Now, there's health benefits to fasting, but that has to be occasional, and that's for digestive health. Most of these athletes that are doing this aren't thinking that not eating for a day is going to actually help them fuel. In fact, the typical conversation when somebody says, I don't know why my times were slower, my lifts were lighter, my performance was down today, the first thing I'm going to ask them is, did you miss any meals that day? How did you eat yesterday or preceding your training? And we can almost always find the gap where something got missed. You can tell if you just go too long without eating and then try and perform. So typically what people will do is they'll fast overnight and then get up in the morning and train. There can be some science, fasting state training in the morning. I just wouldn't push that past a certain point. In other words, if your runs are going to be longer than about 45 minutes to an hour, you're going to start to take a small performance hit in most cases because you're not going into it optimally fueled. And there are lots of ways to decrease caloric intake. It doesn't simply have to be time gating. Time gating can be effective, but it's only one of several methodologies. And here's the bottom line. Most people that are implementing a measure of cyclical or intermittent fasting of any style are not doing so for the health properties. They're doing so for weight loss. That's just the reality, talking day in and day out to people. And they're assuming that the weight loss effects have some correlation to the time gating. There is a correlation, but it's very minor. It's secondary. It's secondary to when you eat in a time-gated fashion, you eat less calories and or less carbs and or in some way, there's a decreased amount of fuel. All things being equal, the impact that it has on weight loss, we're not talking health, we're not talking digestive, just weight loss, is very minimal for the time gating exclusively when you look at the big picture. It's going to be more tied to calories taken in or carbohydrates manipulated, which is why intermittent fasting seems to work really well for people whose diet are very poor to begin with, and people who are already eating very clean will typically express very little benefit out of it. That's simply because someone who's typically used to eating very poor to begin with now have fewer hours out of the day where they're eating poorly. Whereas somebody who's used to eating very clean will typically need to make up for and actually increase the amount of calories that they do eat within that window to continue to perform at a high level, therefore muting the response that they get from it. There are certainly circumstances where a measure of time gating is prudent, and we direct our clients to use that. But as a runner, again, it's probably not the first tool I would be looking for. I'd be looking to get consistent with your meals across the board, balance your overall calories, your macronutrient ratios to suit your needs, and to push your performance with your runs.